I haven't stopped thinking about Julie Heffernan's work ever since I saw it almost 20 years ago. When I started this podcast, I knew that Julie was one of the first people I wanted to sit down with and have a conversation about painting and idea development and what does it mean to build a work of art. And it just so happens when I launched my podcast and was starting to collect conversations with people I look up to, that Julie Heffernan was beginning to promote her graphic novel. So the timing really couldn't have been better for me. I got to sit down with one of my favorite artists and talk about a really major undertaking that she had created and put out into the world. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Julie as much as I did. Welcome to episode 6 of the Open Sketchbook podcast. I'm your host, Evan Kitson. All right, let's go. Hi, Julie.
Hello,
How are
Ed.
you?
Nice to see you.
You as well. I first discovered your paintings through a colleague of mine when we were students. I actually had to hire him to teach me how to paint because in undergrad, no one was teaching indirect oil painting or looking at like classical art except for this student. And so I hired him and he took a trip. I think it was to New York. It might have been to DC, but he saw an exhibition of yours and it melted his brain. And he came back and he was like, you need to learn who this painter is. And I immediately bought a catalog of your work, and I've been staring at it since, and I've been showing you to all my students. And yeah, your stuff is just incredible.
Well, thank you. Thank you. This would have been New York. And do you know what year it was vaguely? I'm just trying to remember
Yeah,
which.
it would have been around 2008, 2009.
Okay. All right. That was, yeah. Yeah. So that would be PPOW.
Yeah, you were with PPOW for a long time, right?
Yes.
Yeah, that's great because I remember seeing a show of yours there. I think that was the show where you removed most of the figures.
Yeah. Yeah. That was, gosh, all I can think is that was the economic downturn.
Yeah.
So I remember I had a show in San Francisco too, and there were issues around that. There was a point where I shifted. I mean, I was always going back and forth between the figure and things that were stand-ins for the figure, but there was definitely a shift in order to take up the issue of climate. At the point that people in my own family were still denying it, most people weren't talking about it. I had read the Elizabeth Colbert 3-part series in the New Yorker called Climate of Man. And, it changed my life. And then Katrina happened, and then Sandy happened. And it was like, this is a game changer. I'm not a politician. I can't do anything about these issues, that way, but I can paint about it. And towards the end of having a traveling exhibition called When the Water Rises that went to red states. So to talk about it. And, there were some really interesting conversations with, a kid in Florida, college students saying, well, why would they be building on the waterfront of Florida if there's climate change? What do you say to that? I mean, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, your work is such a powerful vehicle for those kinds of conversations because you leave room for people to sort of grapple with the poetry of the images that you construct. And I find that your work is so dense that it somehow feels open. Like there's so much to grab onto, so much to explore that something's going to catch you. Just to sit there with it is really amazing.
Well, that's interesting that you say that, because one of the things that I teach my students and have focused on in Babe in the Woods, the graphic novel, is, just the how it's the composition is the brains of the piece, not the subject matter, per se. And so I think what you're saying when they're so dense, but there's things to grab onto is, I think what I'm getting from that is that I try to organize all the stuff to basically to give you access to the most important things.
Yeah. All right. Your graphic novel is incredible. I have been working my way. I sprinted through it when I got it because it's beautiful. And I've been a fan of graphic novels since I was a kid, right? And so now two of my favorite things, incredible figurative poetic painting and graphic novels are combined. And I sprinted through it and then I thought, okay, it's really dense. And so I wanted to just take my time and really slowly work through it. So I'm going back through it now. I'm on like chapter 7 or something, and it's phenomenal. And it feels to me to be a remarkably different experience of engaging with your work, but it still is hands down your work. And that's a really cool thing. If I'm being honest, I wasn't sure what the translation would feel like.
Yeah, that's interesting. So I'm married to a critic, a theater critic. And Jonathan is his name. And I have to give him credit because, he read all the different versions, and the first version was, of course, terrible, but they always are. They have to be. I don't know. Maybe they don't have to be, but mine was. And I remember him saying, I think, well, he said, basically it's about your work. And I was, brought up humble and Catholic and like, can't be about me. It's got to be about great paintings, because the real purpose of the graphic novel as part of my sabbatical application was to not push onto the world, but basically foreground this I always call it wisdom delivery systems, the compositions of great paintings, because they really do deliver wisdom. And I tell my students that, if you traffic in this world, you will get smarter, you will get wiser. I mean, it's true. And there's a reason, like that's what I lay out in the book. So I had thought, no, it's got to be about that. No, that's what it's got to be about. And of course it had to be about that, but it also, at that point I realized, well, I'm implicated in this story and I've got to tell a story. And so hence the story and the paintings found their way in.
Yeah, I was flipping through it and it felt like because you had wrapped it in such a narrative, it felt like a very personal canon of painting history
Mm.
and what they could teach us, and then jumping from painting to painting and how you were explaining the compositions relative to the chapter narratives, and how everything just sort of coalesced into a compositional lesson about painting. It was one of those things where sometimes the narrative explained it and sometimes the composition explained the narrative, and it was a really fun kind of dialogue there that I don't see a lot of art history writing navigate. And so I thought that was really cool.
Yeah, that's exactly the point. I mean, some of my best friends are art historians, but I remember it was actually a woman that I went to undergrad with at UC Santa Cruz, and we were in Nan Rosenthal's art history class. I don't know if she's probably retired by now. I think she taught down in DC somewhere. But anyway, this woman was an artist, was a kind of a groupie in a great way, and she'd be right up in front and I'd be in the back sleeping. And anyway, so years later, 30 years later or so, somehow she got in touch with me. I wish I could remember her name, as I don't remember, but she got in touch with me and she came over, and I had just, well, I had been doing a series of lectures talking about how to tell the story in the form. And they had come out of a lecture at the studio, or at a panel at the studio school. This is a million years ago, about narrative painting. And there were a lot of smart people on the panel. And one of them was a former teacher of mine, Gabriel Latterman. I don't know if you know who he is. He was, kind of tough, and definitely one of the teachers that traumatized me as a grad student. So, it was going to be about narrative painting. And I had never really thought about, well, what is narrative painting? I mean, yeah, there's St. Jerome, with his lion, or, whatever, in different stages of his life in a medieval painting. But what really is a narrative painting? And anyway, I thought about it and scratched my head and came across this essay by Frank Kermode called Secrets and Narrativity. And in it, he talks about literature and how key words in like a Joseph Conrad story will take you to a deeper level of meaning. And I was looking at that Vermeer Woman with a Balance. And this is the painting that I was talking to the art historian who had been a former student, and now she was a full-on art historian. And I said, look at this. What is it about? Well, the question is, art historians say, where do you find satisfaction in life? From worldly goods, because there's the woman with the balance and she's got all her jewels splayed out on her table, or the divine. Behind her is this light coming in from the side that's always the divine light, cut in half right down the middle. This side is light, this side is the assumption into heaven, ascension into heaven. So that's the divine. So you've got the worldly and the divine. And her scales are exactly even. So it seems to be that Vermeer is saying that, you know, that you have to have a balance of both. But if you look at the very center of the painting where her fingers are holding the balance, kind of like this, there's these 3 dots, 1, 2, 3, holding the balance, and they're the upward pointing triangle, which is, a shape that always refers to the Trinity, the divine. And so I was showing this to her saying, that's a giveaway. That's what he really believes. And she was, taken aback. And it made me realize that we artists, we look at things very differently. We're not thinking about what the iconography per se, we're not thinking per se about iconography. That's a component, but we're thinking about the secrets, the things you can insinuate, subtle things that keep meaning rolling forth. And, and again, what the composition can do that might be different from what the story is. Caravaggio deals with that a lot. He goes against Counter-Reformation values, to, even though he's a Counter-Reformation painter, to say, Reformation things.
Yeah, it's such an interesting way of looking at it because, every art student knows what it's like to be in the dark lecture hall, like 8 in the morning, and you're just frantically taking notes on all the iconography in a painting and why it's important and what date it was made. And then immediately you go into a studio and you're wrestling with the formal relationships of an artwork. And you're thinking, well, how can I use what I just was being told to make the still life painting feel like it's more, I remember being at the New York Academy of Art as a student and taking one of your master classes, and you had given an incredible lecture on composition and your work. One of the things that really struck with me is that I don't think you used the words, but you were really sort of leaning into the poetry of the formal relationships and how important they can be and how transformative they can actually be. And sometimes those things get just completely set aside.
Well, interestingly, I remember being in my first semester at grad school at Yale, and Pat Adams was standing in for William Bailey. And she was the first person. I didn't know a thing about composition. They had never talked about composition, in certainly not in my undergrad and I don't know nowhere. And so, I knew nothing about it. And I remember she was the one to show me how my painting, this big old painting that I love, but I didn't know why it was abstract. And I was just like, meaning you have it, but you don't necessarily have words for it. But I think that's great in retrospect because it means that nobody inculcated me with an idea of what composition is. I just got to make it up, for myself.
That's really cool. I could see that going the opposite way though, and I feel like it often does. I feel like composition it's hard to teach because everyone thinks it's foundational. And it is foundational in the sense that it's critical and inevitable, right? Every work of art will have a composition of some kind. I find that when people teach composition, they're usually teaching it from such a fundamental idea of what design can be that they're not really pushing it beyond that. And then it never gets mentioned until your senior thesis, right? Where everyone's telling you that your compositions are good or they're not. How do you think about composition when you're teaching? And do you have any strategies for navigating that? Because it's tough.
Yeah, well, yeah. And this is, my teachers were minimalists or conceptual artists. So they didn't teach composition at all. Composition was basically diagonal or vertical, what's in the middle, what's off center, yeah, you say it's foundational. And I remember as a teacher learning about like echo. Yeah, I didn't learn any of that stuff. Maybe I intuited some of it, but so, I always thought, wow, that's design. That's such a cool thing. um, But needless to say, I give that same lecture that you got to my undergrads at Montclair who, probably don't know what the hell I'm talking about. But I just love those paintings so much that I love to just luxuriate in them. I can't give that lecture to my husband. That's why I keep teaching, so I can keep giving that lecture. And, invariably I'll have one or two bright students who see something I'd never seen. And I've been giving that lecture for 105 years. And these are just kids who like never been to an art museum, and they'll see, they'll say something about what they're looking at or see something. Anyway, it's just, this is the gift that keeps on giving. I always say that paintings are made to be looked at forever. And this really proves that. I can look at these forever.
Yeah, that was one of the most amazing lectures on composition that I had ever seen. And the way that you deliver it is encouraging, because you sit there and you go, look at this. What do you think about that? Here's what I think. Here's this. Do you see that? And everything you were doing was kind of leading us to just look deeper and not recognize, but actually continue searching, you
Nice.
know? Because
Nice.
so often when we read an art history book or we sit through all the classes or we think about it, we recognize what we're told before, you know? And we go, oh, yeah, it's the Vermeer with the light. Yeah, yeah, yeah. But when you recognize something, you almost stop looking.
Mm,
And so, what you had done in that talk was really emphasized to me how critical it is to keep looking.
mm.
And your graphic novel reinforces that tenfold, not only through what you like actually put front and center, where you're like, do you see this? Let me break down a Giotto painting for you, but on my second and third pass through your book, I'm noticing things in the background, echoes that show up in the future of the book that are in the beginning, and these little like nooks and crannies in the background. Or I'm like, is that from a Rembrandt etching? Like things like that, where I'm starting to pick up, and it's a real pleasure just to like sit with the book and go through it linearly a few times.
Great. That's great. I'm so happy to hear that. It's so funny because I'll be sitting there, a page will be effectively done, but I'm messing with the wording or the next page. And so I'll just sit there futzing while I'm trying to figure out the wording. And in a painting, when you futz, it's not that, you shouldn't probably. I don't know. I like futzing. But in a graphic novel, futzing is the thing that, can make things start to speak to later pages and all that. I don't know why every visual artist doesn't do one. I hope they don't, just because I don't want the market to be flooded. But it's really satisfying.
Yeah, well, so there's so many questions I have because it's not common. I think you're one of the first visual artists that I've seen make that determined leap, where you have a really amazing exhibition record, an incredible body of work, and then to go, now it's graphic novel time. That's a big jump, and it's got to be a little scary. What was it like moving from your typical body of work format into a graphic novel format?
On the one hand, I'm a really fast painter. On the other hand, I can work on a painting for 25 years. Like that's all of us. But the thing that's so funny about this graphic novel is I did everything wrong, in the way that we do when we start something, because I'm not a digital person. I didn't know anything about Procreate or Clip Studio or whatever those. I went to Best Buy and said, because I'd first started with rapidographs and, Strathmore paper or whatever it was, and realized quickly that, scanning them and that wasn't going to work. Although a couple pages are those original rapidograph pages, so that's funny. But the guy at Best Buy had me buy a Microsoft Surface Book, which has the paint program,
Hmm.
which it's so primitive. It's one layer.
Well, so which paint program? Are you talking just like Microsoft Paint?
Microsoft Paint. Yeah.
You
Yeah.
did that in Microsoft Paint?
I did that in Microsoft Paint.
How did you do that in
I
Microsoft Paint?
don't know. I don't know now because it was so, I did everything. Everybody else would Google, how do you write a graphic novel? Well, you need to have 3 layers. I didn't Google, how do you make a graphic novel? I didn't take a class. I didn't read a book. I just got this Microsoft Paint. I was so thrilled that I could use it at all because I'd never used a digital paint program, that I just kind of went to town. So when Algonquin wanted to publish it, they then said, you got to expand every page because I had done the type all the way up to the top, and you have to do it in 3 layers, and you can have color on every page because it was all black and white with just those color, painting moments. And so I had to rip the whole thing apart, and it was madness, but and that was all just and then I had to learn InDesign, and that broke my brain, and horrible. But the reason I'm saying all this is because, again, that you make your own rules when you're ignorant, and so I paid my dues because I had to fix everything. And I cried a lot because InDesign is really hard to use. But yeah, it just everything that had a speech bubble, I had to, redraw because the speech bubble was another layer.
Yeah, I'm just that's incredible. Because on one hand, I see how MS Paint would give you complete freedom on a single layer to do what you need to do. And then moving from that literal digital canvas into a program that's designed to layer text and shape and layout, but not organically. Yeah, that's a challenge. Did they try to pair you with someone who could do it with you?
They did not. And I love them very much, but my husband was horrified. It was my problem to solve. I guess I can put on the big girl pants and agree. But
Yeah, I mean, it turned out beautifully, but that
well, I mean, they
surprises
have
me.
Christopher Moisson, is their digital guy, or is their designer guy, or was. And he was a little bit helpful, but that's fair. That's fair. I had to pay for my sins.
Well, it's that's wild. MS Paint. I remember getting access to a computer when I was a little kid and using MS Paint. I would make weird copies of Matisse paintings for book reports and stuff like that in MS Paint. Um,
Oh, that's funny. I thought it was like super, like wow, sophisticated.
it wasn't when I was using it at the time.
No, it's not sophisticated. For somebody who knew nothing, it was like the perfect baby steps.
Well, that's in many ways, that's actually a really cool thing because Procreate and like, Paint Studio and all that stuff, there's so many options underneath the surface that it feels like you never know enough, right? And it's kind of the thing that stops people from painting because you'll sit there and you go, just get these 4 colors, get whatever brushes that are a little stiff, and get this medium and just whatever canvas, paint it gray, let's get started. And then they have this paralysis at the art store because there's 100 brushes and they're all kind of the same but different. And then there's all these paint things, and it's like they don't know what to do because they don't want to do it wrong.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'll tell you, Microsoft Paint has a brush that I've never been able to find again on Procreate that I love so much more than any of the brushes on Procreate. It's this funny little wiggly brush that goes thinner and thicker, and I love it. And I don't, somebody sent me a brush library, but I didn't know, since you can't try them, or that as far as I know, you can't. They also had some fonts that Procreate I had to buy for Procreate, but there's no italic in this MV Boli, which is the only font that I like.
Yeah, the fonts really look great.
Well, thank you. Algonquin did not like me using MV Boli or Chiller, but I love Chiller because for me it wasn't like a haunted house; it was like a brush, and I loved MV Boli just because it's, I don't know, because all the other, I should have made my own font, but I don't know how to do that.
Well, also, how much time do you have? Like
I,
that's a
I mean,
lot.
if somebody had held my hand, I would have happily made a font, but I had all these other things to learn. But point being that that Paint had MV Boli in bold in italic. And I really needed that for like, that's how you create, the spoken word feel of a graphic novel. I don't have any italics in this one I'm doing now on Procreate. And everything's capitalized. It's just driving me nuts.
There's a wonderful moment in the book where you hand write the text out,
Mm.
and it's like it's the right amount of remove and emphasis for that moment. And did you ever think about doing more hand lettering, or was that just like this is a great effect, but I don't want the font to get in the way of the rest of the art?
Yeah, yeah, no, that I make too many changes to the wording. I mean, again, if I made up my own font and I could just type it in, that would be the smartest thing. And maybe I'll do that. But just, right, I'm on a second graphic novel and I'm just trying to bang it out. But once I have the story, maybe I'll bite the bullet and learn how to make my own font with italics.
Yeah, that's so great. So, are there any artists that work in the medium of graphic novels that you've been looking at?
I teach now a graphic novel course, and I obviously show them Persepolis and Fun Home and Mouse and a few others. And Persepolis I mean, they're all exquisite, especially Persepolis because it's so simple and just But a lot of graphic novels leave me flummoxed, and my students have a whole slew of other graphic novels that they love that leave me cold. So yeah, it's the thing of, you want to write the graphic novel that you wish you could read. And I have people have given me some great ones, but I don't know. I just love reading, you know. So unless there's a reason, I mean that's the whole point. That Babe in the Woods had a reason to be a graphic novel, and I think a lot of graphic novels are just an excuse kind of not to actually read a book.
Mm.
From some of my students, maybe.
Yeah, that's a really interesting point. I ask my students a lot, like, what are you all reading? What's going on now? Is there something that's grabbing your attention? Anything finding its way from a book into your work? And it's always graphic novels.
Yeah, and that's great. I mean,
Yeah, it's really yeah.
if they're good, do you find? I mean, what are your favorites?
I tend to have favorite artists. That's the thing that it's one of the reasons I think I haven't made a graphic novel yet, even though when I was in college, that's what I said I was going to do.
Mhm.
Is for me, it's always just been the art. And so I just kind of stuck with that. One of my favorite graphic novel artists is Dave McKeon. He has a graphic novel called Cages that I really like, that feels sort of like a journey of an artist kind of just looking out at life and relationships, and it's a pretty cool thing.
McKeon. I've seen that name.
McKean.
EAN. Oh, McKean.
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah.
McKean. I'll see if Libby has cages. Do you know Libby?
Yes.
Okay. Well, they have graphic novels now. Did you know that?
I just interviewed another artist, Leah Gardner, and she was really emphatic with Libby and kind of got me doing more searches. Yeah, it was really cool. Yeah, so I guess the other big question is I read your graphic novel, and the composition lessons are gorgeous. And it made me think about, okay, how did you consider composition in the graphic novel format? Because in your work, you deal with vignettes and nested imagery all the time, but there's a very sound logic to the way something is read and experienced in a graphic novel format that a painting doesn't have to abide by. And so I was wondering, is that something that you would futz with?
Yeah, yeah. That was a lot of fun, and I learned on the go. Obviously we read left to right and, top to bottom. And so, following that basic thing, if I deviated even a little bit, the energy would just drop. And that was, obvious. But what I started to really love is how, yeah, you could change the pacing of a thought visually. So, if something is occurring to her and she says, where am I? This doesn't look familiar. and then way down. So where am I? This doesn't look familiar. And then way down here is, am I dot, 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 question mark, and then the next page, lost,
Yeah.
I mean, that was just so much fun. And I would, that's kind of, I would love to do that in a painting. I would love to have paintings that you could just turn the page.
Well, I was gonna ask if you've ever messed with a diptych or a triptych or anything, or
Yeah, yeah, I have, but not in a graphic novel way. I mean, as much as I've been able to, I've tried to insinuate text, and ways that don't illustrate or overwhelm. And I think they've worked, but it's so limited what you can do because it has to engage on a kind of a profound level as opposed to just get you to turn the page.
yeah. Yeah, there's something when painters include text in the work, it really changes the way a viewer engages with the painting
Yeah.
because they're gonna recognize the text immediately, and that's their key, right? They hang on it, and in a graphic novel, it doesn't stop you, it keeps you flowing.
Yeah. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, exactly. And, I worry when you said it's really dense because I know it is. And part of it is my fault because, I had to cut some pages and it's like, I can't cut that page. So I would slam it into the page before that. And it's like, I should have really just, um, but the feeling was that, just like a painting should be looked can be looked at forever. I hope that this book can be read, over and over.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's been wonderful, and each reread, I've been able to bring what happens later on in the story for context into the beginning, and then that's been really fun. It's been really great. It has the experience of almost film in the sense that it really feels like a dialogue. And I think that that's a cool thing to have created that effect when you hadn't really done it before. So that's great. Were you thinking of films while you were making it? Like scenes or actors or things like that?
I mean, I love film as, any visual person does. And it was clear to me that, you were talking about the composition of the page. And the first iteration was you know, two by two, 4 panels, or maybe 3 by 2, or two 1 over 1, all those different possibilities. And and the story got told, but it's like, in the editing, erasing those lines and letting things flow into each other was like the next shift so that each page could have a kind of filmic continuity.
Yeah.
And that was, just so much fun. I mean, yeah, just changing the meaning when, it's a close up or a faraway silhouette, or, just boy, what fun to make a film. Maybe that'll be my next lifetime.
Yeah, I mean, the thing with the graphic novel where you have to do it all yourself and just kind of work it out. I mean, that's a whole task. Can you imagine collaborating with everyone involved in filmmaking?
Oh my God, we had a film made here in our house a couple weeks ago by a young filmmaker just making a short. The amount of equipment. This was just a short by basically a student, an NYU graduate, and his partner. I mean, her, she's the director, but the point is they got an NYU crew, and it was just like the house was crammed with equipment. And I just have my one little laptop, and thank God.
I know. It's pretty astounding that anyone's able to keep an authorial voice in film, you know?
I know, I know. Yeah. Yeah, that's gotta be a huge ego.
And it shows sometimes, right? um I when I first saw your work, I had also just around the same time been introduced to Peter Greenaway. Do you know his films?
Love him. In fact, I mean, a draftsman's contract, which you cannot get anymore, not even on Criterion.
I know. I've been having a really hard time finding that. I'm glad I have couple friends that have given me copies. I heard that there's something like a 12-hour cut of that film. Which, like, I don't I like to think I have the patience where I could stick with 12 hours of that, but I don't know.
Wow, wow, I'm trying to think if, how would you get access to it if you did decide you had 12 hours?
Well, so the myth goes that only Peter has it, and I think once a year he rents out a theater and just watches it himself or something silly, you know?
But he's British, he wouldn't be
Yeah.
in New York. Okay,
Right, right.
okay.
Yeah.
Um, if you have a copy that I could, like,
Sure,
pay you for,
sure.
God, I would love that because my son, Oliver Kalb, he's a big cinephile. He's teaching film history, and anyway, yeah, we've been talking about Peter Greenaway a lot.
Yeah, when I first saw his work and I had the catalog of yours, there's this level of, like, opulence and excess and decor in both, because I was thinking of the, self-portrait wearing a dress of dead animals and things like that, and, like, really powerful imagery that at the time I didn't really know what to do with except for just, like, stare, you know? I was like, "This is really amazing." And then when I was thinking about your graphic novel, and then I was thinking about how Greenaway will almost put visual panels over his film because he wants to remind you you're watching a film, you know? And so he'll have additional video panels overlaid on his movie or animations that he'll add, right? And I thought that's kind of interesting. There's some sort of like compilation or collage idea of a narrative taking place. And I had just thought, yeah, it's there was something there for my brain that helped me make sense of both again. And that was just a cool feeling to come back to.
Mhm, mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, I haven't seen the films for 30 years, so I'm gonna have to refresh myself about what you're saying. That sounds very cool.
It's really fun because it kind of happens out of nowhere and because his narratives are a little they're dark and funny and you feel like maybe you shouldn't be watching them, things like that. And you're like, oh wait, there's some weird animation now that he did. Yeah. Yeah.
In Draftsman's Contract, there's animation?
Not in Draftsman's
Okay.
Contract. No, that I think he really stuck to, that time period feeling where he was giving just enough clues in the background, right?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah. Well, Jane Campion is possibly my favorite. Definitely my favorite director in the sense that I think she takes you to rarefied places like Greenaway does, but also kind of dealing with some profound aspect of femaleness, which women need to see more of. I mean, I remember seeing the piano for the first time, and I'm not a weeper, but the credits went up and I just found myself weeping and I'm like, what am I doing? And then watched it again and I found myself weeping and I realized I was weeping because I had seen something that reflected my experience, which had never happened. I was, in my mid 20s whenever that film came out. Maybe I was older. Yeah, I probably was older. Yeah, that's huge.
Yeah, that film breaks me every time.
Mm.
And I have a friend that teaches amazing film classes out here in Pennsylvania, and I'll sit in on them, and I can't sit in on that one anymore, because I'm a teacher, and I'm like the kids can't see me just bawling, like I have to keep a little bit of authority, a little bit.
Wow, wow. So this just makes anybody weep.
I think it's one of the greatest masterpieces of film. It's in my top 5.
Good, good. Well,
Yeah.
in a funny way, I mean, Holy Smoke with Harvey Keitel and Kate Winslet, it's very different, but it's a stunner, dealing with that difficult subject matter of giving yourself over to a guru and, all this doubt and suspicion that goes along with it. Did you see Holy Smoke?
I have had it recommended to me because of Kate Winslet, because when she just had done, it was a TV series, and because that TV series was like a
Mayor
crime
Mayor of
East Town,
Yeah.
and because it had the Pennsylvania Dutch thing going on, everyone around here was talking about it, and I was like, "Oh, yeah, what's she been up to?" And my friend that teaches film was like, "You have to watch this movie," and I haven't gotten to it yet, but Yeah, he was emphatic that it's a beautiful, difficult performance.
Well, and you know, scenario, because Harvey Keitel is supposed to break her of the guru, but she doesn't need breaking. She sees something entirely different in this rarefied experience. Anyway,
I gotta check that out.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thank you. That's so cool. When you said you're a fast painter, I find it hard to believe that a little bit, because your paintings have a pretty sizable scale and they're layered. What's a typical painting process for you like? I mean, I'm sure you've gotten it completely worked out, but
Well, I mean, worked out. That's a funny way of putting it because every painting is its own planet, that you have to explore and know nothing about. I mean, certainly when it comes to the women in the middle with the animal skirts, yes, I kind of had that worked out. Although those were interesting because um, I was brought up Catholic, and the powerful imagery in our house was not paintings on the walls, but it was holy cards in like the medicine chest that you'd open up. And there would be this little image of Saint Lucy holding her breasts that she'd sacrificed for her love of God, and Saint Agnes with her eyeballs. And I just loved that. And as I said, my teachers were minimalists and conceptual artists, which was great, but it did not have the passion that Saint Lucy and Saint Agnes had. So when I started to kind of figure out who I was as an artist, which took a long time, I mean, as it should, I kind of came back to those holy cards, but writ large, 6 foot, my human scale. And so it was simple, like this is just a woman holding something of import. Um, hopefully, a condensed metaphor holding that with the skirt. But the thing that, and then a background that either is a commentary on the foolishness of humans, in contrast to her dignity, because she had to have a kind of dignity, or I wanted to give her a kind of dignity, and with the backdrop of all this, human folly, a la Bosch and Bruegel, is this woman, contained. But what I discovered in the making is that the skirt itself had to have a kind of a swirl to it, a kind of unstable, compositionally balanced swirl, because she, in fact, isn't, um, you know, stable. I mean, there's no stability. So yeah, so even situations where I kind of know what I'm going to do involve a lot of reckoning with the painting taking me off balance, making me lose something in order to gain something more. So those would have been the most straightforward of compositions, but everything else is really a matter of, as Kyle Staver would put it, what is that? What's that pool game? Marco Polo. Marco Polo. Call and response. You do something, the painting, calls you back to do something else. You do it, the painting, calls you back to do yet another things. Yeah. So the reason I'm a fast painter is because I'm really good at responding without like worry that I'm going to destroy something that I just spent, a week doing. Because if it doesn't work anymore, it's got to go.
yeah, that type of response is, I mean, I feel like that's an earned thing over years. Because a lot of like people when we teach them, they're so nervous to misstep. They want a prescription, right? They want like, just tell me what to do to make this beautiful or make it great or good. And I said, well, you just got to work it out. I said, here's some tools, not steps, tools. And yeah, I mean, what was it like learning that type of responsiveness? As I guess, like, I always think the antithesis of response is anticipation, right? Like you're sitting there anticipating everything that's coming next, but during that process, you have to respond to what's there or respond to what's not working or respond to a new context, right? So how I mean, if you have an answer, but because it's a little bit of a hard question, like how might you advise someone to learn that kind of responsiveness?
Well, this is going to sound, I don't know how it's going to sound, but, I always equate it with, your 2-year-old runs in and they've got, they've, I don't know, put on a great outfit, but they have poop smeared all over their butt. You don't compliment them on the great outfit they put together. This is analogy is going awry, but
I
you
love it.
sweep
Yeah.
in, you fix what's immediately screaming at you as, emergency, emergency. The thing that I love so much about painting is every stroke you make, and go back to your couch, and I have a mirror back here and I look at the painting through the mirror so it flips it, and every time I do a stroke and then look at it in the mirror, I see everything wrong, that a minute ago felt right. And that means that your brain is reforming second by second. I mean, to experience your brain be able to shift and change so quickly is a miracle. I mean, so you basically were engaged in an activity that is just is our changing mind on light speed. I was listening to a really interesting podcast. Maybe it was Radio Lab, I don't remember, but it was a neuroscientist talking about what's called the critical period. So 0 to 2, are you familiar with this?
No.
Age 0 to 2, our brains are forming, and we're forming all kinds of neural connections, and we're just, we're putting our brain together in this brilliant, quick, fast action way, and it's like, explosive. And that's called the critical period, when all that's happening. And then at about 2, the door shuts, and you've made what you've made and you kind of live off that. And then in early adolescence, the critical period opens again. So that's all that adolescent change. And that always corresponds. I was just talking to a friend, realizing that the church that you've been attending is hypocritical, and the parents that you've been obeying are flawed, and it's the critical period where your brain is on fire again, and then that door closes, and it pretty much doesn't open again. And the point of the podcast, which was fascinating, is that psychotropic drugs open the critical period. And I don't take drugs. I don't do anything. I don't even drink coffee. But I was fascinated because not only do they open the critical period, but you need obviously guidance. So that's why, war veterans with PTSD are going to ayahuasca, because it opens a critical period, allows you to re-knit your brain and, maybe have a life. One of the cool parts that this neuroscientist talked about is that each drug, MDMA, psilocybin, et cetera, they give you a limited number of opportunities to open the door, like 30 to 40. And then it doesn't work anymore. So you can go to another drug. But if you've spent your 20s, so the point being that if you're in your 70s and you have a stroke and you lose, neural connections in your hand, if you take one of these drugs, it can open the critical period, knit the nerves. But if you spent your 20s going clubbing, doing ecstasy, that the MDMA is not going to work for you when you need it. And I always knew that these were way too powerful and I couldn't play with them. But anyway, the reason I said all that is because every time I paint, I think, well, wait a minute, I'm making all these neural connections. So what about that critical period where the door closes? So I don't know, I don't know. I would like to ask that neuroscientist about that, because I can feel my brain change.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. I do think a lot about the power of metacognition. Just the idea that you're thinking about how you're thinking, opens you up to new ideas and new processes and challenges, sort of habits that may be getting in our way without us realizing just because they're habits.
Yeah.
And so it sounds like you're actively challenging the painter's habit that you have, you know?
Well, it feels more moment to moment because you make a swipe and it changes everything, and you got to respond to that all the changes that whirled into place at that. And yeah.
That's really cool. Let's see. The trees in your graphic novel are so beautifully designed. It's great because it takes place in a forest, almost the whole time. And I was looking through the trees and I'm thinking a lot about, all the beautiful drawings of foliage in the Rococo period and moving into sort of what we have now, the rediscovery of like academic landscape and how they don't really have the same spirit. What artists in the past have you found to be an influence in how you consider trees? I mean, your trees are unlike anyone else's trees because you've really been exploring them. But it's something I was really becoming aware of, that I was looking at drawn trees from you, and I had only ever seen painted trees, and it's a different language.
Yeah, well, I put in the acknowledgments that I'm grateful to 19th century engraving. So I was in a conversation with 19th century engravers and etchers and all that. So I'd pull it in and then paint into it, or digitally paint into it or draw into it. And that was my process, was being in this visual conversation with all kinds of different tree, Samuel Palmer, and people I love. So, yeah, yeah,
That's really cool.
that's the joy of digital.
Yeah, and it for me, it was really fun to look at like a survey of mark making from you that I really hadn't seen before in the paintings. So could you talk a little bit about how you thought about line versus mass? I mean, that's like really formal, but I mean, it's a very different medium to make lines and marks digitally.
Yeah, well, I mean, they are like breathing, they're worlds of activity. And so, part of that, what I was telling you before, messing around while I'm thinking about the shifts in verbal edits was, all that mark making. There's a lot of busy work in art making, and it can be used as a kind of a slow creaking gate opener to the next thought. I mean, my whole painting practice has been using rendering to get me to the next thought. There's that painting in relation to the Winchester Mystery House, with that has all the rooms. And that was very, very much about how to let the activity of the making of one room make suggestions in my mind for the next room. And then, then when you're actually rendering it, it's kind of dull and uninspired, but it's creating the juice for the next room. So all that busy work is useful catalytic work.
That's really cool. So when you were working on that painting, you finished it room by room?
Well, what I do is I mean, what anybody would do if they know anything about painting. You have swirls of color here and there, and then you make each room, and then you imagine your way into those swirls of color, with a million different references that kind of excite you. So yeah, you slowly, so no, I would not just room to room. But
Okay.
at a point after the swirl of color had formed into something, then that process would go into play.
That's really cool. Yeah, when I was looking at the graphic novel, I guess I keep coming back to mark making because I'm primarily a draftsman, and I was just wondering, like, because it is a different language, it is a translation of your typical creative practice. Did you find that like you fell in love with a certain type of like squiggle to build form or put color somewhere that's not in your paintings?
I think, aren't we always kind of doing that to see what our brushes will do? The pressing down and lightening up, and isn't that sort of what our hands do?
I think a lot of us, but I think a lot of us that work representationally do have a vocabulary of mark making. It's our grammar, you know?
Hmm.
And I was wondering if the shift in medium in both the digital format and the narrative format, encouraged a new addition to your vocabulary?
Well, absolutely. I mean, mainly because I don't really draw. I don't draw. I don't draw pencil to paper. It's clunky. So having to draw was reminding me of how really, and this is where that funny little brush in Microsoft Paint, I loved it so much because I would have to, on the pages that, it would be, the main character with her friend who has curly hair, well, it's cartooning and I'm not a cartoonist. So, making a little shape and then sticking some features and then crazy hair. It's like, oh, it was so much scarier than doing a tree, which is a lot more complicated. But just to nail that was, exciting and really hard. You would really have to focus. I mean, I would practically have to pace and then do it just so that I could do it with real, attention and focus. It's not something you do lightly.
Yeah, for sure.
I
That's
guess
really
it's like
cool.
maybe Japanese brush painting or something. You got to really be focused and
Yeah, which is that's just magic, right? Well, yeah, I guess the other question I had about technique with the digital translation, you can undo. Did you find yourself undoing the mark, or would you erase it or scribble out, or yeah, because that's a whole different thing.
yeah, and I'm sure, I could go through the novel with you and, point out all these places where I overdrew, but it didn't matter because you just needed to go on with the story. And, there was the idea that later on I'll come back and I'll make it simpler and perfect, which, you don't have to do because the point is to advance the story. So in that sense, it's forgiving. And in that sense, it's not, I guess maybe, well, I was going to say maybe that's the difference between fine art and graphic art, that if it was fine art, I'd really have to just nail it in that perfect way. But it's graphic art, so it's more forgiving.
Yeah, it's not the end all be all of the aim of the project. Yeah,
Right. Yeah.
yeah, that's really cool. So you said you're working on another one?
Yeah. No, I mean, I'd started it on paint with the dumb, speech bubbles right there in the one layer. And then, went through the whole fiasco of having to rip apart the novel, Babe in the Woods and worked on that for a year. But then I pulled those pages out and just kind of fell into it again. Again, the story that I thought it was going to be about, it has shifted and, developed and tendrilled out to take on a lot more subplots. But it's just, yeah, it's a lot of fun. So
Yeah.
each one, I think, okay, I've said everything I need to say. I don't have another story to tell. And so I'm right now feeling like, because I'm finishing the second draft and like the story is clear. It needs tons and tons of tweaking, but it's like I don't have another story after this, and and I hope that's not true.
I mean, I can't think that it would be because you just released Babe in the Woods and then you're starting a second and you've also been making paintings and teaching.
I mean, I guess we keep moving on until we die, right?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, that's a lot of it's a lot of work for the paintings that you've made during this time. Did you find that they were wanting to be a part of the graphic novel, or that format was leaking into their construction a little bit more, or did you find it easy to like set that aside?
Yeah, as we were saying earlier, bringing in text is its own thing, and I think about like Glenn Baxter, who his work. He'll have like a little cartoony text. Um, that I don't want to do that. That becomes kind of a one-liner. They're fun, but not for me. I have insinuated stories like where Carrie James Marshall will have ribbons, like in that one picnic scene there'll be ribbons of, I think it's music, and also early Renaissance or late medieval will have those ribbons. I'm always fascinated by what needs to be written down, what words can we read over and over again? And they're usually words that actually don't mean anything to us, like Latin words or alleluia or something. But that's a whole ball of wax that I don't want to tread into. So no, the paintings seem to continue to exist on their own terms. But I'm always open to how the graphic novel can shift them.
Yeah, it's a really interesting thing, and it doesn't surprise me because the format feels so front and center with the graphic novel. Like it doesn't get in the way, but it does keep you moving. And with the paintings, there's the painting, you know, where you don't have that burden of keep the energy up because it's all energy, you know.
Yeah.
So that's really neat. Can you share anything about your next graphic novel? Don't feel pressure to do so, but
Well, okay, so it was going to be, just like the Babe was going to be just a way of exposing or using visual means to illustrate composition. I was thinking, well, people don't really know what it is to make a painting. So let me use the graphic novel format to show what it is to make a painting. So it was about a frustrated painter out of grad school who's, because leaving grad school, I was as lost as when I came in. I just knew a little bit more, a lot more. So, the story maybe I've told, but I went to Berlin on a Fulbright, and that gave me a lot of time to just paint all day. And I was painting these expressionistic paintings that were like, sort of Jorg Immendorf meets Picasso meets Tintoretto or something. And I loved making them, but then I hated them when I was finished. So it was like crisis, crisis, crisis. So then that thing happened where I passed out one day, and not passed out, but just took a nap, and started, before falling asleep, started to notice the pictures coming into my head, which I found out later is called image streaming, but for me it was all new, and they were so spontaneously interesting and not forced and not something I'd seen before. They weren't like memories or daydreams, but just, your brain rearranging things like a dream in its own, having its own logic that's you could follow and appreciate. That, the crisis became, am I willing to throw out everything I'd been doing, which I was, and am I willing to devote certain amount of time to figuring out how to use these image streaming thought bubbles, all of which is sure. So anyway, so I thought that would be visually interesting, possibly as a script. Well, it wasn't. So anyway, so now it's now engaging two other characters that are based on people that I went to grad school with, that, and kind of a critique of the institution, because Yale was famous for being really cutthroat. And also the institution itself doesn't pay taxes to the town. So the town is kind of immiserated. So, and weaving into it some, other things. Yeah. So
well, I
that's,
mean, that sounds fantastic, and I'm excited to see what shape it finds itself in. Because yeah, I love the first graphic novel, and I'm really excited that you're doing another one. I was gonna ask if you planned on doing another one. I didn't realize you were like really into doing it already.
yeah. Yeah.
That's so cool. For all right, so based on our conversation so far, it's obvious to me that you're willing to respond to the work and do what's needed, right? Like we've chatted towards that, but when you made the decision to go after those image streams, did you completely throw out the body of work and that path that you had been building for a while and just dive wholeheartedly into this new path, or was there some like overlap period?
I certainly, there's overlap. It's a profound thing to, honestly respond to your own work and say, I loved making you and now I hate you. Must be the way some people feel about their kids. I don't know. I luckily don't feel that way about my kids. But yeah, you gaze upon something and it's a reflection of you because you made it. But you know what it is? I was trying to be a social critic. I was in Berlin and bringing in all this history with Frederick the Great and World War II. I was trying to make these profound statements about the folly of humankind and that sort of thing. And one of the things I noticed when I was doing the When the Water Rises series, responding to climate change, is the first paintings were, the intention was to really stick it to Gulf Oil and ExxonMobil and the oil companies, and use paint to like show the ugliness of oil slicks and all that. And those paintings just failed. And it was when I shifted and started to make the paintings about living up in trees, options for when the waters rise. When the first stop on the Water Rises tour was in Baton Rouge, and they had just had a huge flood, and all these mattresses were out on the sidewalks that had gotten wet and moldy and had to be thrown out. And the centerpiece of that show it's a painting called Camp Bedlam, and it's all these trees and these mattresses that are piling up to create other kinds of structures for living, different sorts of tents and lean-tos and shelters. The point being that the kind of painter that I am is not a social critic. I mean, there's a critical eye, but those Berlin paintings were trying to be this, powerful, like Georg Immendorf, these powerful social critiques, and that's not what I do. So these image streaming images were kind of a exploration of, and weirdly celebration of, just the richness of the subconscious. And so the first foray into just foregrounding them and making it about them were those still lives. And the still lives I was teaching myself to paint in that, luscious, beautiful way that Dave Hickey talks about, beauty arguing for something. And so the big persimmons and golden pears of Juan Sanchez de Cotan became the sort of movie screens for my thought bubbles. And that accorded with who I am, that I am a lover of beauty, to, like a hostess at a party that dressed nicely, that invites you in. And then the dinner table conversation is full of controversy and Sturm und Drang,
Yeah, that's beautifully said. And yeah, that's how I kind of felt when I was first looking at your paintings, because I was like, this might be one of the most beautiful, lavish paintings I've ever seen. And then I spent time with it. I was like, what the hell am I looking at? The connections I would form, and it left me with more questions than answers. And I remember thinking that that's pretty cool, because I had never that's not common, especially when you're an undergrad. Everything has an answer, right? So it was really cool. It was really wonderful. So, with the body of work that you determined, that you just said, this isn't working for me, I'm not happy with you. It was fun making it, but that's it. And so you tossed it out. You pursued a new thread. The audit of the new work must have been intense, because you're sitting there like, I wasn't happy before. What does it feel like to be happy with my work? Like,
Well, that's a great question, because it was sort of the opposite, in the sense that everything, I remember my kids were really little. My son Oliver was really little, and I didn't have 20 hours to spend in the studio every day. So having stumbled on the still lives, the Juan Sanchez de Cotan inspired still lives, I knew what I was doing going into the studio, and I could do them, and with my limited time available, and and the sketched out things I remembered from these image streaming sessions, and not being the kind of artist that keeps a notebook with all kinds of great thoughts and date. I mean, I jot things down, but I've never kept a notebook. The painting became like a notebook, where something that occurred to me that I'd read, I could trace on there, or write out and then transfer onto the painting. And it became like one of those beautiful notebook pages that I love so much in other people's notebooks. So you say the audit was probably high. It was, when you found your language, you're no longer lambasting yourself for missing the mark. You're just like, I'm here. I got my language. I can talk now. So it was really the opposite. It was much easier, and I was easier on myself until I got sick of those still lives and had to shift again. So we're always throwing ourselves a new set of problems to wrangle with. That's part of it. But you get a grace period where in the wrangling, you're finding yourself and you're in your element.
That's fantastic. Yeah, it I wish I had been able to talk to you more when I was in grad school, because that's how I felt, you know?
Were you in crisis?
I think every grad student is a little bit in crisis,
Yeah,
you
if
know?
you're not, you're doing something wrong.
It's an intense few years.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I always tell everybody, if you don't go through at least three, the classic three crises, you're doing something wrong. You're complacent, I don't know, you're missing the point. The point is to keep peeling the layers off the onion.
Well, thanks, Julie. This has been an absolute blast. When it comes to your graphic novel, it's on Amazon, but where else can people find it?
Well, in San Francisco, it's at Catherine Clark Gallery. They have a store. It was at the Strand. I assume there's still signed copies at the Strand. Seems to be in most of the major bookstores. I mean, people tell me that they saw it at, there was one at Center for Fiction. Anyway, yeah, I hope they're all there. The Golden Notebook in Woodstock gave me the windows, did these beautiful window displays. They have many copies, or they had. So yeah, community bookstore, etc.
That's fantastic. Awesome. Well, I'll definitely have to reach out to the Strand and see if they have a signed copy. So I have two questions that I always ask everybody. What was the hardest thing for you to unlearn?
Probably being a pleaser. So there was a very interesting book, in on the topic of imagination and empathy. There was a book that was really important to my generation by Alice Miller called The Drama of the Gifted Child. And in it, she talks about a certain kind of super sensitive child who um, learns very quickly to squelch their own impulses in order to keep their mother alive. Mother, yeah. Because, they literally think that if they act out, they'll kill their mother. And one of the reasons I think I gravitated to painting is because it didn't have any words. And in my Catholic family, to use words could very much destroy people or kill them. So yeah, so I learned to keep my mouth shut and find twisty ways to get what I needed out of life. But the massage oil, to make that all work was to be a people pleaser. And the thing that I learned in doing the graphic novel, which I thought was never going to see the light of day, is that given an opportunity to just say what I think, that superseded the need to please people. So does that make sense?
But absolutely makes sense. Yeah, that's a fantastic answer. And I think that's one of yeah, unlearning that and still finding your power in existing and making what you need to make
Yeah,
can
no, I
be
remember
hard.
I had a painting full of naked ladies. They were just cavorting. It wasn't pornographic or anything. But I remember my mother, who's a very kind woman, very loving woman, but looking at it and sort of shaking her head in disapproval and thinking, okay, that's fine. That's I'm not doing it to please you. So yeah, yeah. Something bigger than you that goes beyond.
Really cool. What are two wholehearted recommendations that you can share? You've been very generous with sharing books, artists, films, and all of that. But do you have two major recommendations that all the listeners should just go check out?
Well, I had a year of reading brilliantly. I call it the year of living dangerously, the year of reading brilliantly. I mean, I just read one amazing book after another. I discovered Abraham Verghese, Cutting for Stone, beautiful book about an Indian doctor working in Ethiopia. And you learn, not only do you get caught up in this incredible whirl of a story, but you learn like what a fistula is and how you fix it, how to do a vasectomy. Kind of great. So yeah, they would all be books.
That's fantastic. Do you have a couple?
Yeah, sure. So also Benjamin Labatut wrote a book, When We Cease to Understand the World, which takes you into the minds of all the great physicists, the 20th century physicists. And for me, who never did well in physics or math, and yet, this is what the world is made of. To feel like I could crawl into Schrodinger's mind and Heisenberg's mind without needing math was just such a gift. And it's so poetically, beautifully written.
Yeah, the first chapter of that book packs such a punch.
Oh my God. Yeah. About
Yeah.
what's his name? The guy who Cyclone B.
Yeah.
What is his name? How could I forget his name? Anyway, him.
Yeah. I mean, so yeah, that's really cool to hear that. I haven't read his follow-up book, which was The Maniac.
I did read Maniac, and it was math people. And I
Okay.
learned a lot, but it gets really heavy into Go, the game, the Chinese game, which didn't, and chess with a robot, and I didn't care that much about all.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Very cool. These books are fantastic. Do you have one more for us?
Sure. Hernan Diaz, who wrote Trust, it's a brilliant book. He also wrote this book called Into the Distance about two brothers that are separated, and they're from Europe. They come to America to escape strife, and they lose each other, and he kind of sails all the way around to the West Coast, and he's trying to make his way back to his brother, but he's a very tall man, and he becomes a kind of a legend in the push west of pioneers. The way that somebody can unwittingly become a legend and be a trope for evil and terror because the situation of life is terrible. Anyway, it's just beautifully, beautifully written and very compelling. And yeah, Into the Distance, Hernan Diaz.
Sounds amazing. All right, really cool. Thanks, Julie.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thank you so much, Julie, for your time, your generous answers, and an amazing book list for us to check out. That was awesome. I want to just one more time really encourage you to pick up Julie's graphic novel, Babe in the Woods or The Art of Getting Lost. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it in some local bookshops. I still haven't made it to the Strand yet. I keep meaning to because I'd love to get a signed copy. To learn more about her graphic novel, head over to Julie's website at julieheffernan.net. And while you're browsing the web, head over to theopensketchbook.com. Check out the virtual studio online community where you can find behind the scenes podcast information, upcoming guests, exclusive episodes, and just keep the conversation going. We also do weekly Zoom hangouts and a bunch of other fun stuff. If you enjoyed this episode and you're watching on YouTube, please like and subscribe. It really makes a big difference. And if you're listening to the audio version of this episode on one of your favorite podcast apps, it really, really helps me if you could leave a review and spread the word. Tell someone else that you think will really like what we're up to. Thanks for being here. I'll see you next week.